Hey, my SUPA class. This is the second part of the chapter 23 lecture that I started and posted for you guys yesterday. In today's lecture, we are going to jump into slides 8 through, I believe, 12, I think is the conclusion in this PowerPoint, and focus more on like the political and the economic changes of the Roaring Twenties. Remember, we said the Roaring Twenties was a time period of massive upheaval and change throughout the United States. So, jumping right back into that PowerPoint that you'll have access to in the Google Classroom, let's look at slide 8, which gets into 1920s immigration policy. It would be in the 1920s when you would see the introduction of the quota. The quota was just really a form of the United States really shutting the door and being more restrictive of who we let into the United States. And the original 1921 Immigration Act kind of just set a flat quota for the U.S. And then what they would do in the 1924 is they would pass the National Origins Act, and they would set more hard, specific quotas for different nations. And they favored immigrants coming from Northern and Western Europe. Understand, immigrants from Northern and Western Europe were predominantly English-speaking and Protestant. This country was founded by white English-speaking Protestants. In that 1924 Origins Act, it set lower quotas for people from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia, those that were quote-unquote different, right? The new immigrants. And basically, it is another example of nativism. And what's this whole idea of nativism? The idea that the government should create policies that favor the native-born American. You're kind of living through it. In today's day and age, when it comes to immigration, President Trump was elected under the premise of 2016, I want to build a wall between the United States and Mexico to protect the American worker. His argument for it, whether one agrees with the president or disagrees with it, his argument was, it will keep out illegal immigrants that can take American jobs, and it can also be dangerous. It's a nativist policy. By building that, you'll protect the native-born American. Well, in the 1920s, it was quotas were put in place to protect the native-born American from foreigners. Moving on to slide 9, we're going to talk about the emergence of the Klan. The Ku Klux Klan had a re-emergence in the 20th century. And they used the film. The Birth of a Nation was a film in Hollywood that really portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as like saviors of, traditional American culture. Saviors of the United States, and painted them as heroes. And they did have an emergence, and they used, they organized themselves, and they spread out throughout the United States. And what were they piggybacking on? This resentment against foreigners. Think about how that ties into immigration. The Klan does not like people that are different from themselves. And with this fear of immigration, and this influx of immigrants, it was like a perfect storm for them to mobilize. And like I pointed out on slide 9, that by 1924 they had over 3 million members across the United States. So the 1920s was a time period where the Klan would reemerge. And what would happen as that decade came to its conclusion, they would run into their own internal problems, and the Klan would start to fall off again. But unfortunately, we still have these hate groups and these supremacy groups throughout the United States today. Moving on to number 10, slide 10, religious fundamentalism versus science. And this is like the modern argument today that traditional religious fundamentalists will have about an issue like marriage. A traditional religious fundamentalist might look at marriage as belong to a man and a woman. Or in modern society, you have the Supreme Court has basically told the states you can't deny same-sex couples the right to marriage. Well, let's rewind. Let's go back to the 1920s, and let's look at the argument of religious fundamentalism versus science, and it dealt with the theory of evolution. In many states, most notably those in the South, the Bible Belt in this country, it was illegal to teach evolution in classrooms. Well, John Scopes decides to teach evolution in Tennessee, which happens to be down south and happens to be in the Bible Belt. He gets arrested for that. And he looks at it like science is theory. I'm teaching theory. That's my job. That's what I'm supposed to do. And it gets national media attention, and it gets called the monkey trial, and it's one of the big moments of the decade. So the verdict, despite Scopes getting convicted, eventually gets thrown out, and they would stop cracking down on people for teaching evolution, but it would still remain a frowned upon idea in southern states. But this is that classic example of religious fundamentalism versus science, or not even necessarily in this case science, but really versus modern America. Science in modern America looked at it. It's okay to teach evolution. Religious fundamentalism, the biblical story. God created the world in X amount of days. So it was like a classic example of modern America versus traditional America. In the 1920s, it all comes to light. And you've seen many of those issues. We use the example with traditional America versus modern America with same-sex marriage here in present-day America. Moving on to slide 11, Republican control of the White House. It would be in the 1920s where the Republicans would dominate the White House. And understand that this was a time period of laissez-faire economics. That's hands off. The government not really get involved in business, just let business be, and deregulate. And that's ultimately one of the more Republican economic principles which you see in the United States today. Typically, Republicans are more hands off, less regulation. Tax cuts for big business. In the 1920s was synonymous with that between Harding, Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. And there was ultimately a good relationship between big business and government pretty much left them alone. And what that led to in the 1920s was, moving on to our final slide 12, was buying stock on margin. No real regulation of the stock market. And what was buying stock on margin? People were buying stock, and they were only paying a small percentage of it, paying, say, 10% down. And if you think about that, they're buying stock with money they don't have. The general idea behind that was based on speculation, because Americans believed in the 1920s that we were stuck in prosperity, that the American economy and wages would grow and stock prices would just keep going up and up and up and up and up. So I'll buy stock on margin, even though I don't have the money. And then when the price goes up, I sell it, I pay back what I owe, and then I pocket all the profit. Well, that works great as long as stock prices go up. But the American economy was flawed. Many businesses were overproducing and under-consuming. They were still producing at World War I levels, both farms and factories. Well, during the 1920s, when the world was no longer at war, European farms and factories come back into the marketplace. So naturally, American producers and American farmers should have been reducing their production levels. Well, they didn't. That's not a good business model. So these were some bad elements in the 1920s economy that people weren't necessarily paying attention to. And the whole concept of speculation, buying on credit. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a country where you're encouraged to buy now, pay later. I've used the example, when you check out at a grocery not a grocery store, but at a department store, you can use your Macy's card today. Many of you will get asked that question. Well, what is your Macy's card? Well, it's a credit card. You're charging it with the idea of paying it back later. Many people bought things on credit because they felt that, the American economy is great. I'm for sure going to have the money later. Well, needless to say, we know at the end of the 1920s, when the stock market fell apart due to many of the underlying factors that I just mentioned, people no longer had the money. And things were bought that were never really paid for. It's kind of like when the housing market fell apart during the Great Recession in 2009. So, there's a lot of similarities. This idea of false prosperity. It was in the early 2000s where people just bought homes assuming, I'll just sell it because the price is going to go up. I'll buy it at one price and I'll sell it at a higher price. Very similar to the 1920s. If you guys have any questions, email me. And as always, I hope you guys are all doing well. Take care.